Glory, dignity, and honor do not have another price. I understand. Now in tears, I understand. Catastrophe destroys, but it also exposes. And through lamentations, we learn the importance of community, restoration, and rebellion. And now, Tiana, you can go ahead. And what brings you into this work?
Well, I feel like you and Anais have like not only just dropped the mic, but set it on fire and have left me with nothing but the ashes. That was so beautiful. Hello everyone. My name is Tiana. I'm going to be the main moderator for this event. And currently I'm a postdoc at Rutgers University. But originally, I'm from Southeast Washington, D.C., which has been stewarded by the Mattaponi and Piscataway nations for millennia, who continue to challenge colonialism, erasure, and enclosure. And also where Black folks have practiced their own freedom by bucking against systems of slavery, Jim Crow, and in the more contemporary sense, gentrification. So again, I want to thank my sibling scholars, Anais and Kiana, for setting such a beautiful tone for this evening's discussion. One of the things about the After the Storm Lab is that our work is held together really through a framework of love that enables us to write histories of catastrophe across Puerto Rico and Mississippi, even if those two spaces may seem very disparate and different. We aim to amplify diasporic bonds and histories of struggle and rebellion without collapsing or flattening what makes each place unique. We think about how Afro-diasporic women author their own survival rooted in place, build and rebuild new worlds, and speak back against colonial erasure that thrive in contemporary discourses around the end of the world. I also want to share my own sort of catastrophe story and what brought me into this work. So my understanding of catastrophe has been radically shaped by Mississippi, where I experienced firsthand the impacts of a major catastrophe that hit this majority Black city. In February 2021, two snowstorms hit Jackson, Mississippi in a 48-hour period that triggered the first Jackson water crisis. Thousands of people lost heat, water, and electricity for 6 weeks. But a city bereft of water was just one of the stories, as I also witnessed Black people taking to the streets and using the backdrop of frozen roads, frozen pipes, and freezing homes to organize, who, in the cover of darkness and snowflakes, amplified Black aliveness to contest what is possible after the storm. So I want to thank my community of West Jackson, who truly helped me down through the coldest and darkest moments. And as I made sense of catastrophe as ongoing in its own tempo, I turned to Audre Lorde, who too wrote by candlelight in the aftermath of Hurricane Hugo that decimated St. Croix and other places in 1989. So I just wanted to close by sharing her words. The earth is telling us something about our conduct of living, as well as about our abuse of this covenant we live upon. Not one of us can believe himself or herself untouched by these messages, no matter where she or he lives, no matter under what illusion of safety or uninvolvement we may pretend to hide. Each one of us has some power that can be used somewhere, somehow, to help save our earth. And the next time you think choosing a rub-on deodorant instead of an aerosol is the only thing you can do to make a difference, just feel what kind of ecological violence it does to hurl 40 tons of revolving plutonium up into the sky over our heads and call it scientific progress, which is what the USA has just done in our name with our money. And remember Hurricane Hugo. My friend, I wish you were living down the road, rocky as it may be. It is still also the most beautiful. We'd swap stories of how it was and how it is and how it's surely going to be, end quote. And so as Kiana sort of transitioned us into sharing the bios of our marvelous panelists, I invite all of you who are comfortable to drop in the chat your own relationship to the term catastrophe and how it has radicalized you. And of course, continue telling us where you're from.
I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. So I will begin by introducing Dr. Bedour Alagraa. She's an assistant professor of Black Studies at the University of Texas in Austin. She's a wayward political theorist, author of The Interminable Catastrophe, co-editor of Black Critique book series at Pluto Press, Political Philosophy, Histories of Political Concept, Caribbean Thought, Black Marxism, African Anti-Colonial Thought. She's also interested in playing with words and breaking the pentameter. We have Erika Dickerson-Despenza, who's a New Orleans-based Black radical leftist writer, eco-womanist, and cultural memory worker, Afro-surrealism, Afro-pessimism, magical realism, narrative, rememory, kinesthetic imagination, and Black queer women's interiority and erotic futivity are conceptual preoccupations of her work. Erika's primal thematic foci are Black land legacies, Black apocalyptic ritual, and environmental racism. And then we have J.T. Roane, who's an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Geography, and Andrew W. Mellon Chair in Global Racial Justice in the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University. Roane's short experimental film Plot received support from Princeton's Crossroad Fellowship. He also currently serves as a member of Just Harvest, Tidewater, an Indigenous and Black-led organization building towards food sovereignty and justice in Virginia's historical plantation region through political and practical education. Thank you so much for being here with us. And Tiana, you could go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. And thank you again to our esteemed panelists for being here today. We're just so excited to be hosting y'all and to have this conversation. I wanted to sort of like open the floor for you all to sort of share some opening reflections on thinking about what brought you to the concept of catastrophe. What are the stories that radicalized or marked you? And what are the tools that allow you to come to catastrophe differently? And I believe we're going to start with Erika.
Oh man, first of all, I want to say thank you for the invitation. I bring you greetings currently from Manhattan, whose original inhabitants are the Lenape. I am a 8th generation New Orleanian paternally, and so I want to acknowledge the original inhabitants of that land, the Chitimacha, the Aracapa, the Caddo, the Choctaw, the Hauma, the Natchez, and the Tunica. Also acknowledging all of the Black people, diasporically Black, right, who shaped, toiled, and culturally made that land. Your question is so full, and so I will do my best to tend to every part of it. First of all, what brought me to considering catastrophe, being with it? I think being indisputably Black, meaning I don't walk into a room and have an experience of people being in doubt about how I am racialized, right? Like everywhere I walk in, I am perceived as Black, right? And so walking around as a Black queer person in the world brings with it the politics of catastrophe, right? Like thinking about the original catastrophe, which is colonialism and thereby slavery, right? I am already walking into a legacy of catastrophe in the afterlife of slavery, which we are currently living in. I'm also thinking about, and thank you for bringing up Audre Lorde, because I'm thinking about the letters that she was writing after Hugo as well, particularly the September 18th, 1989 letter. And I believe it's in the last line that she says, "There is little time to think about anything other than physical safety and survival. We have stepped out into a world forever altered." And I think this is still true today. And so when I am considering catastrophe, it is because it is a constant condition of our world, as well as in my personal world and in my family. So like I said, paternally, I'm a descendant of enslaved and free Black people as an 8th generation New Orleanian with roots also in greater Louisiana, including Claiborne Parish, St. Helena Parish, and Ruston, Louisiana. So yeah, I'm thinking of Hurricane Katrina and the flood thereafter. as it is important to distinguish between those two events. But I'm also thinking of Hurricane Betsy, blown levees, last island, right, 1856, and the 1811 insurrection. And of course, always, everywhere, slavery and its afterlife. I'm also thinking about Kamau Brathwaite, who tells us, right, art must come out of catastrophe. And I think largely I am an artist to make sense of the world that I'm living in, which is a state of actual catastrophe and anticipated catastrophe, right? Particularly as a person who is currently living in and inhabiting New Orleans, which is in hurricane season, like half of our year is hurricane season. And so when we think about preparing for catastrophe, what we call natural catastrophe, right, which is really a response that Earth is having to the ways in which it has been and is being ruined. I think about what it is to always be on the precipice of catastrophe. And so I write about it a lot. I think a lot about Flint and the Flint water crisis, which is still happening, and thereafter, right, Jackson's water crisis and water crises that are all over our country. I mean, Lansing, Michigan is the only city in the United States that has completely replaced its lead piping system. And so every day I am drinking water and, like, you know, investigating, where is it from? Is it clean today? What are we dealing with in terms of the four elements, wherever we are in the world daily? And really interrogating that for myself and inviting others to interrogate that with me. So that has brought me to think about and with catastrophe in my work.
Oh, thank you. We'll pass it to Bedour.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Yes, great. So how did I arrive at this? You know, it's hard to answer this question. You would think it would be easier answering this question after writing like an entire book just about this one concept, but I find it's more difficult it's like trying to catch a cloud and pin it down now that I've got so much to say and it's right at my fingertips, but I'll try to streamline it a little bit. You know, I start my book and I start all of my conversations by saying that I was 15 years old when Hurricane Katrina happened. I'm from Toronto and I was living in Toronto, and it was single-handedly the thing that politicized me the quickest and the earliest, I would say, in my adolescence. And I remember distinctly like watching the news with my mother specifically, and I had never seen her react to anything the way that I saw her react to the images coming out of New Orleans. And this is somebody who, my family is from Sudan, like, so someone who's had family displaced by wars also in the Middle East, by all kinds of things that impacted her directly. And I'd never seen her respond to anything on the news the way she did to Hurricane Katrina. And that, I think, signaled to me that there was something else happening here. And I remember speaking to her later and saying, and this is a woman who had lived in Iraq as a late teen, she said to me that the worst thing that President Bush did was not necessarily the invasion of Iraq, but Hurricane Katrina. To her, that was the worst thing that she could think of. And I don't know about how you could say what's worse. I mean, it's all bad. Like, but for someone like her to hold on to that specific moment in that way, even though she'd never even been there before, it was something that really moved me deeply. And I also say that, you know, I'm a millennial. I'm of the climate generation, right? I am, like, if you think about it, you know, we were a generation that were still but were very much subjected to like an apparent increase, right, in the frequency of like political and ecological like upheavals, you know, the fear of a Y2K apocalypse, 9/11, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, Hurricane Katrina, the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. So I came of an age in a time where incredible energy was harnessed to feed an obsession with perfecting the science and the technology required to predict how much time exactly we have left on the planet. And that became the whole of the concern of the climate generation. Not how are we going to live together on this planet, but obsessed with developing this computational language to think about how many years we have left. And Cedric Robinson called it the mechanical hand jive of science, of little scientific frameworks, right? But we came of age in that time, right? And then soon we were bombarded with predictions and then subsequent revisions to those predictions, right? After those predictions were disproved. And this kept happening over and over again. The world's going to end in 2012. Actually, 2052, we've got this much time left, and so on and so forth. And then I realized, even as a teenager, that our generation's like forced adoption and like conscription into this really sadistic thinking and timekeeping was really distressing and unfair, given one, the inaccuracy of all the predictions, right? And second, they were useless. They weren't giving us any information about how we're going to live together on this planet at any case, no matter how much time we have left, right? And then when I was like 20, right, I'm in college, and I realized I'm like no longer interested in conceding my time to the clockmakers or timekeepers that were responsible for that discourse. And this is before I arrived at this specific project. I decided I'm getting off the clock, because you only have to get it wrong once for me to realize that maybe what you're doing, right, is creating a narrative for you to carry out rather than making what you might perceive to be a prediction, right? And so I realized that what was repeating was this idea of the end, right? And then, right, I come to graduate school. I've decided that I'm going to write a dissertation on this in general, right? And my idea is that I'm thinking about catastrophe as a kind of like political concept. Like we can use it as a way to explain all kinds of things in the way we use other concepts like freedom and, I don't know, sovereignty and rights or whatever it is, right? And then my PhD advisor, Anthony Bogues, said to me, well, what do you mean by catastrophe? And I was like, well, I'm going with what came out back. He said, but that's what he means. What do you mean by catastrophe? Because is that sufficient for you? Has that solved the riddle for you? And I was like, well, no, actually, no, it hasn't. And that's kind of what catapulted me into this work and into returning to that feeling that I had as a teen of the really distressing feeling of feeling like I was in this bad time loop, right? That the timekeepers were not actually trying to make predictions. They were trying to lock me into a bind, right? That was not of my making. And in doing so, they were trying to, right, kind of predict and conscribe my behavior, right? That was what they were trying to do in any case. And so this is where I started to develop my idea around catastrophe as a repeating concept and as a way of life, right? And as a kind of bad infinity, right? Where it's defined by a repetition, but the repetition is a repetition with a twist, and just enough of a twist that it liquidates enough of our prior experience of that thing, so that when it reappears, that twist is what tells us this is unprecedented. This has never happened before. We don't know how to respond to this. We don't have the tools to live any longer here, right? And I realized that those predictions about the end were being made not because they were trying to predict the end, but that the idea of the end is what cohered all of our activities and our behaviors. It was the idea of it. And so that's kind of how I came to it. I have more to say, obviously, but that's that on that.
Go ahead, JT. I hope y'all don't feel like I have to call on y'all. But go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was like, let me jump in, or not. Yeah, thank you all so much for this. Already this conversation is off to such a wonderful clip, and I'm glad to meet you, my other two co-panelists, and to see the folks with the lab and all of that. So thank you. It's fascinating. I think someone needs to, if there's not a good dissertation or book already, or maybe not a scholarly book, but some kind of book that accounts for the role that Katrina has played in the politicization of so many of us. I know, for example, one of my good collaborators and co-conspirators, Justin Holsby, and I were both politicized as sophomores in undergrad in that moment, right? So I think there's a lot to be said about having had to endure after the kind of liberal drivel of the 90s and the early 2000s to watch in real time as people were disabused of any sense that they meant anything or that their lives meant anything. That is a critical moment for a lot of us. But I want to just return to something that's more personal. So one of the strongest memories I have of my grandmother was her extreme fear of thunderstorms and tornadoes. As I recall multiple times, if you've heard me in public discussions, this used to really tickle me as a cocky adolescent. In part, it tickled me because she was always a very fierce, no nonsense type of woman, even at 4'11". So to see her erupt from the sound of thunder into uncontrollable shaking and actually verifiable fear endeared her to me all the more. It punctuated her otherwise unflappable fierceness. And to be frank, struck me as a little down home country to be that afraid. I also thought to myself, and notably not out loud, she's afraid based on television accounts of the destructive storms in the Midwest, because of course, for sure, we don't have these kind of storms in the Tidewater of Virginia. And then it happened. 6 years after she passed away, a tornado came down in a freak, or perhaps not so freak, given the increasing energy absorbed by the atmosphere accumulated from slavery and genocide, coal and cotton, and more recently, oil and nuclear arsenal testing, and blew everything away around her grave. It's a 150-year-old church building and flung it in the woods, took some of the heavy headstones off their spot and across the yard, blew Bibles and hymnals across a mile-wide river and landed them in a whole other county. It was this sudden disaster that in some ways I kind of returned directly to thinking about ecologies. I had done like a environmental governance school in high school, but I thought because of the way that was so isolated, to be straight up as white science, I was like, this don't got nothing to do with me. I'm just passing through this to get somewhere else. But this sudden disaster brought it all back to me, and all of that back to me. And I think it began to return me directly to the traditions of living in world making and disaster, the Black ecological epistemes that are engendered from what others might deem as outlandish or disproportionate fear, or anchored in something called tuition, or a sense or a creeping feeling of anxiety that has no scientific basis or merit. I had for many years, even when I didn't visit the church or the churchyard, held onto it as a place that had always been there and would always be there. As a trained historian, and geographer, you might point out that that's foolhardy in general to believe something is that permanent. But I think I was longing for this understanding that somewhere could be a permanence. Prior to this particular catastrophe, I had been accustomed to viewing the church and the churchyard as a kind of home place, a place where, though my father's family has no property, could claim no land, could claim no home place, had no singular site of origin or returns, that I held on to this place as that point of possibility. I held its sounds, its smells, its colors, its creakiness, as well as its rituals in myself long after I stopped going regularly beyond funerals or family and friend days or revivals or some other big eventful homecoming like gatherings. Earlier around 12, when I had lost one of my great aunts, my grandmother's sister, who had been the sort of leading figure and glue of our family, I had begun to latch on to the church, in part because at that point, when she died, I realized that where she lived, she rented, and that there was no return to that space. And so I think, and then all of a sudden, so was the church also gone. So I've been trying to make sense of catastrophe in this frame, to make sense of it as sudden, unexpected loss, but also the ways and the means of knowing and being that have emerged within our own family, in our wider communities and beyond from this kind of serial catastrophe. Catastrophe names a form of sudden loss or interruption in the integrity of place or community. This isn't antithetical to the slow forms of death and violence that are meted out, especially in a rural area in Virginia. These two frequencies and forms constantly commingle and cohabitate. And sometimes it's just there in the hearts of those who are always losing somebody they love too early and for no verifiable reason outside somebody else's comfort or greed or nonchalance about our living and dying and all that comes between. What does catastrophe even mean in a place whose landscape and social worlds are marked by the enduring ruptures of the transatlantic slave trade, the saltwater and coffle domestic trades that took half of everybody, the total warscape of the Civil War, a brief opening of possibility followed by a deadly and unequal Jim Crow erection, overlaid by the Great Hurricane of 1933 and a whole bunch of tornadoes that I've subsequently found out also happened in that period. By 1970s, rapid industrialization that didn't give a damn about place, followed within 15 to 20 years by rapid deindustrialization that again didn't care about nobody and nowhere, and made that place into nowhere with nobody. And now by rising water, a horizon of inhabitability, given the rising salinity of shallow wells that most people drink out of because of Jim Crow water architectures, and the fragility and cheapness of life when your community is being replicated within the green horizon as just a place to make biofuels that nobody cares if the babies or the elders live, breathe, or die, or anything else. I've started to recover from then this kind of work and compiling it through a project that is under the working title Black Ecologies, Tidewater, Virginia, which comes again from the Great Hurricane of 33 through the early 2000s, weaving together archival research, memory, nostalgia, and other modes of recall that I think are really bound with catastrophe. And we could talk more about that, the ways that historical records, and I mean that of the paper and oral form, but also the modes of recall, the nostalgic and other forms are punctuated by catastrophe and the ways that those operate in tandem, or at least in perhaps some more complex geometry. And I also just more recently about June Jordan and her work. I'm in her archives now, and just about the ways that she recognized that kind of disaster and catastrophe was every day. And to your point, Tiana, I think really for her it came to a head after visiting Mississippi and engaging what she called the hunger counties, right? Like the reality that there were still counties in Mississippi that were hungry, even though it was the most fertile land on earth. So that's a kind of journey through catastrophe for me, how it manifests viscerally, but how I've begun to really try to think with it and through it about Black ecological possibilities and world making and all that. So thank you.
Woof, I feel like we're like in church right now, just stomping the roof down. This is so incredible. Thank you to each of you for like your insights. And I think in many different ways, y'all have sort of started to hint at in your sort of genealogies of what brought you to catastrophe, of how it's sort of coming to take meaning or shape in your work. But I'm hoping we can just sort of get a little more specific around that. And I would just be interested in how you all are sort of actually defining and thinking about catastrophe. If you want to provide like examples, something I've been thinking about from engaging with each of you all's work is like, Bedour, you use interminable catastrophe. JT from Black Ecologies, the line that it lives rent-free in my head is like this ongoing proximity to disaster. Erika, you're sort of bucking at what's traditionally thought of as catastrophe by thinking about Flint, by thinking about like these ongoing like water crises. So I would love to for you all to sort of like give us some working definition and even sort of think about how you all are sort of thinking about these concepts, whether it's through Black Ecologies, the interminable catastrophe, or this beautiful play Colored Water, what's sort of holding it all together. And I think, JT, you can't stay muted for too long because you're kicking us off with this one.
Oops, I should have paid attention to when I was coming and where, so I had my stuff all timed
Want
out.
me to say it again?
No, it's good. It's good. I think, yeah, I've been really working with June Jordan at this particular point. So I have kind of two projects that really center around, I think, the environment, and therefore, out of necessity, in some relation to the catastrophic and and the kind of world and the realities of Black life in the quotidian and eventful ways that those happen. And I think for me, I'm interested in and through Black ecologies as catastrophe and disaster as a point of translation and engagement across, and I think we'll get further into this later, but across diasporic communities, not as a one-to-one structural equivalence across what we know are vast inequalities along the diaspora, but at least points of possibility for staging alternative possibilities for connection, and understanding one another, and that within the diaspora and also within the wider Blackened world, right? And by that, I mean the ways that the conditions of enslavement, the forced extraction from mines, the consolidation of plantation ecologies, the way that while that was confined to the experience of Indigenous and African folks who were transshipped to the Americas and displaced, how that is now the conditioning of the whole world, right? When we step outside and it's a forest fire, we might as well be in the mine digging coal or whatever ourselves because we also can't breathe. So I think Jordan really points out to me sort of the kind of other modes. And so I wanted to just read a very quick line from Jordan, from her OK Now draft, which is a novel that Jordan did not publish, but began around 71, drafted halfway by 76, drafted again in the early 1980s after the Reagan administration is elected. And then in 96, I believe, following her experiences directly with what she, I think, knew would be terminal breast cancer, she returns to this project, which centers a successful land reform project in Mississippi near Ruleville, and was based really on her 70 trip to Mississippi, but also the contradictions that she saw and witnessed when she traveled to the following year for the Rome Prize to Rome, and particularly took a side trip to Mykonos in Greece. She's just been in Mississippi, again, the most fertile land in the world, where lots of people are hungry and where there are hung counties. And she gets to Mykonos, where she's like, and this may be just her outside observation, but she's like, it's a rock. It doesn't grow anything. These people can't grow oranges. They can't grow anything. And yet, while walking around in Mykonos on a day, a few day excursion from Rome, she realizes, wait, these people don't suffer hunger, right? And it makes her it's funny to see now that like the American Academy in Rome is, they recently did the exhibition of her work, because Jordan left right after that. She did not pull the full year. She was like, this inspired me. I'm going back. I got to write about Mississippi and it won't be here in Rome. So she left. Now they like, yeah, June Jordan was here. I'm like, I don't know if y'all talked about her the same way when she left unexpectedly, but anyway. And so, but I guess that juxtaposition between these well-fed, relatively happy people from her perspective as an outsider, in contradistinction with the reality of starvation and really like ridiculous amounts of starvation concentrated in those Mississippi counties. And so OK Now takes place in the context in which these people have decided to leave places like Brownsville, Brooklyn, south side of Chicago to go to this land reform project. Of course, Jordan is not romantic in this. She's like, look, people are not going to just suddenly come to this utopic space and have utopia, right? And OK Now with an exclamation point is the title, in part because it's like, well, what happens now that this land reform has happened? And it's messy, right? The drafting is messy. I want to read, that was a long way to get to this quote, but I want to read what it does, what she does here around how people are drawn together across these kinds of catastrophes, right? The kind of slow and eventful. And she's talking about how these people came together. Gut and spirit hunger brought the folks out to the same place, kneeling face to face. well, not kneeling exactly. Some raised a great shout and a song that would not quit. Some stood around or shook hands. Some kept quiet or quickly made connection or laugh, but everyone was kneeling in his or her head. All of them were getting married today to all of them. And I think what Jordan is inviting here, and even through the kind of vexed and complicated analogy or metaphor of a communal marriage, is the renewal of how we belong to each other through in and through the catastrophic, in and through the combined, what she combines here as the kind of physical hunger and the emotional and spiritual toll that catastrophe plays through, again, what she calls spirit hunger. I'll hush now.
Yes. Okay, go ahead, Bedour.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for that, JT. This has been my entire project, just like trying to define catastrophe or trying to offer an autonomous space in which catastrophe might be articulated that is detached from a lot of the possessive investments in periodization and taxonomy that the Anthropocenic frame encloses us in. And what I came to realize was, well, I had a thought about Hurricane Hugo. What's interesting about Hurricane Hugo is that it was actually a cyclone and not actually a hurricane. And it was a cyclone, and it started off the coast of Cape Verde and then made its way to the Caribbean. And most hurricanes in the Caribbean happen over warmer water closer, right? But cyclones can travel much farther, which is interesting, But in any case, that's just me being pedantic. So in my offering of a different kind of definition of catastrophe, what I'm writing against essentially is this idea that one, right, the Anthropocene has enclosed our time sense, right? The idea is that they tell us where we are now and where we're going. But the problem is, right, they have not, those who are theologizing the Anthropocenic frame, right, don't recognize that they've left out the people who have been there from the very beginning of the process itself, right, which are enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples. And so this is a framework that gets the beginning wrong, and yet we're supposed to trust its time sense of where we are and also for what the end is. And that just sounds nuts to me, right? So there's that. But there's also a way that catastrophe has typically been understood as one or a series of bad events that have happened, right? And when I was kind of looking around at the world around me as a teenager, what I was finding most distressing was not that bad things were happening, but that I was enclosed inside of a loop in which bad things were happening, and I was being fed the lie that these were novel every time they happened, when I knew that they weren't, even in the short life that I'd lived, right? So I said, what is it about catastrophe that allows us to detach even from our own memory, right? To present these things, number one, as events, as singular, and as novel, to look around at the world and say things have never happened before when they have, right? So I said, there's a repetition, but what repeats is not the actual structure itself, but the structure repeats, but the historical moment doesn't repeat, which is why that twist is so seductive. And it allows us, right, to, again, liquidate our memory of that very same thing happening, to look around and then say, this has never happened before. We don't know what to do, right? So there's that. But then I realized to myself, given my own kind of like background and training in certain kinds of fields, I knew that wherever I read the word structure, right, that structure is a conceit for relation, right? So then I said to myself, well, then that must mean that catastrophe is a relation, right? And that all of these attendant paradigms that stabilize catastrophe as an idea, extinction, the end, are relations. Right. And so I looked around me and said, people are calling certain things extinction events. How can there be anybody here to call something an extinction event if extinction was a complete process? Clearly, extinction must be a relation. And those who make declarations about extinction are establishing themselves on one side of the power asymmetry in such a relation, right? So catastrophe must also be a relation, but a relation between whom? right? And so I just tried to follow one after the other. And I realized that our understanding of catastrophe was a theological holdover, right, from these early modern European empirical and theological debates concerning, right, calamity and how, I think a lot of people don't recognize that Malthus was trained as a cleric and as an economist at the same time, right? And so his idea is that, number one, scarcity is a fundamental feature of the planet, right, was one thing. But the other thing is that, when bad things happen, it teaches people virtue. So virtuous behavior is what helps us to stay away from the onset of the catastrophic. And this is baked into the Anthropocenic paradigm. All they do is tell us, if you behave the right way, we can buy a few more years for the planet. And that is a theological, right, an empirical holdover from the early modern period, right? And then, right, given the way the ideas around scarcity baked into Malthus, which then bakes them in, right, to Cuvier, and then Cuvier bakes them into Darwin, because that's the genealogy, right? Cuvier being the person who gave us the study of extinction as we know it, right? The idea, right, is that it's a foregone conclusion that some people will have their needs met and others won't, right? And the way we can come to that conclusion is that those who act in the right way will have their needs met, and those who don't will not have their needs met. And actually, you don't need to look at the behavior. You just need to actually look at who suffers, and then you can deduce the behavior from that. You can start at the end and work your way backwards. That's what the Anthropocenic frame gives us as well. Something bad happens, well, what did they do? Do they use electric cars? Do they compost, right? So there's that. And then I also realized that there's a rhythm to catastrophic, that it's not simply a repetition, right? But it's like a metronome in music. There's a certain meter, right, to the catastrophic. And it is contrapuntal. So there's a meter, there's like a top line, right, that is apparent, the hurricanes, the earthquakes, et cetera, and so forth. There's the baseline that pulls it all together, right, which is what I call in my work the cruel mathematics, this low hum of violence, of daily deprivation, of degradation, of the not meeting of basic needs, right, the very unsexy, right, perception of catastrophe, which is what stabilizes the entire order of the catastrophic, is that low hum, right? Every once in a while, right, that low hum coagulates into a particular explosion on the surface, right, which we then see as hurricanes or what have you. But we, and I'm including us Black Studies scholars in this, we pay attention only to those explosions on the surface because we have a preoccupation with Kant's sublime aesthetics. We only want to talk about floodwater and oozing lava and the earth pulling itself apart in an earthquake, right? And then we contribute, right, to the disavowing of that concealed nucleus of the catastrophic, which is the day-to-day, everyday degradation that loads the gun, and the hurricane just pulls the trigger, right? Then I also, right, was thinking, well, there's a relationship to land in this as well. And so I realized that if the fundamental paradigm of the modern colonial period is that of scarcity and trying to outrun this apparently kind of natural problem of scarcity, right, that what you needed to do was try to tame abundance in any moment that you might encounter it. And that was what the New World Project was the idea, as Kant delineated it, right, that the world is spherical, and so there's a limited amount of physical space on the planet, and because of that, right, hospitality is conditional, and you need borders, and you need this, and that's why perpetual peace matters, because there's a scarcity, because Kant was trained as a geographer before he was as a philosopher, right? So now you have a remedy to this problem that threatens perpetual peace, which is the colonies, right? So when Locke said in the beginning, all the world was America, he meant it. It was not just a thought experiment, right? It was a way to remedy the problem of scarcity. But where you have land, you need rule, right? And you had to establish at the outset, right? Again, because scarcity is baked into every single place, you have to establish at the outset who was a threat to this scarce condition, and who was the person who was going to protect whatever apparently scarce and not really scarce, right? And so now, right, you have this kind of bad infinity loop, right? This time sense of, right, they predict the end doesn't come, but it's the idea of the end that is the kind of concealed nucleus of every repetition, right? The repetition doesn't propel itself without this idea of the end, which kind of like kind of makes us seize in place and just go along with repetition because we're like, this is the end, right? And we're immobilized by it, right? And so in this way, I was trying to think about catastrophe as like a kind of central frame, and then all of these things as constellations that circulated around the idea of catastrophe: the cruel mathematics, the fatal liberalisms and the sovereignty, the bad infinity, the feedback loop, the low hum of violence, that all of these things work together, right, in a constellation to give us a catastrophic way of life, right? And in response to the catastrophic, right, the only thing that I could see, right, from having visited people and talking to people and doing all these things was, as Sylvia Wynter called it, right, the only thing that Black people held in common was also the only thing that I could identify in response to the catastrophic. And that response was, it actually was not possibility or hope or any of these things. Sometimes it was, but most of the case it wasn't. Most of the time it was, well, we need to move on, right? And when she says it's the idea that what makes Black people who we are is always keeping our traveling shoes nearby, that this tendency to always domesticate change, as she calls it, right? And then the question that comes up is, if we always keep our traveling shoes nearby, if movement is as natural to us as scarcity was, right? Minds of Europeans, that when we move, what's going to move against us, right? And are we prepared to meet that? Because when bad things happen and people literally have to move, right? It's not kumbaya when they arrive. People move against them and are met with violence, right? And so to me, it all ties together under the question of not how long do we have left, not how do we reverse certain kind of physical features of the planet, but what are we going to do to live together now that we are here? And now that we know that the possibility of the same, right, is actually a guarantee tomorrow and the next day, right? As C.L.R. James said, that the slave dreaded the sunrise every day because he knew, right, what was to follow that next day. And so it all circulates around that kind of question. And so it's a little gloomier, right, than what I had set out to be, but I think it's appropriate to the conditions around us currently.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I mean, you'll just see, Bedour, the chat is lighting up and people are like, we want the book now. No pressure, but people want the book now. We'll shift to Erika, and I just want to say quickly, we will have time for Q&A. I know we started a few minutes behind, but we'll jump to Erika. I'm going to sneak in one more question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
What company I'm in, okay? Can I just say that? I'm excited for the book. I'm excited to get into JT's book. Thank you for everything that you all have shared already. Here is where I'm at, right? I'm looking at catastrophe as the environmental vernacular of Black life. A slow and steady, real and anticipated violence, right? A dispossession of the people reflected in the land, water, air, right? The environment. And so there's never been ontological security for people, especially Black people. Like, we know this, despite how New World colonial encounters and imperial powers, right, strove and strive to ensure their own survival at the cost of everyone and everything else's. And so conceptually, I think catastrophe has been tied to rendering Earth's ecology as inhospitable to humans, in inhospitable wilderness. And I do think the wild is inhospitable. I was chatting with my good sis, Jerry Hilt, about being a descendant of Maroons in Southeast Louisiana and what it was like for her growing up in and on the swamp, for real, for real. And it is inhospitable to humans' agendas that are not about safeguarding the wellness of the wilderness. And so I think this is at the crux of the way I use the concept as an analytic counter-narrative around catastrophe. Additionally, I'm thinking about Michael Mead's book, Why the World Doesn't End, Tales of Renewal in Times of Loss. It has a couple of gems in there. There's a lot that I'm like, but I'm really interested in how Mead shared that in Greek theater, catastrophe is defined as a crucial turning point in the last scenes of the drama being played out on stage, right? And as a person who is a theater maker, I'm thinking about that a lot. He also shares that, like, it has a root meaning that means a reversal of what's expected. think plot twists, think new knowledges, think the unveiled undercurrents, right? And so the root of apocalypse, because I think that we need to talk about the distinction between the two as well as the similarities, right? The root of apocalypse in Greek means to reveal and to uncover, but also to disclose, to discover, and finally to lift the veil. And so it's not simply the end of things as we know it, but it is an end of things as we understand it. And I think that's an important nuance difference, right? Like, I'm thinking about, as Bedour just shared and pointing to like how we actually understand the difference between catastrophe as a concept, a politic, and a condition. And so right now, the tight web of our world as we know it has loosened and collapsed. And so what veil is lifted in the ruin? This is what I'm interested in theory and praxis, but also theatrically, which I think is the intermediary between theory and praxis. Theater allows us to stage an encounter, to stage relation. And so in staging relation, we're able to audition solutions, right, to everyday catastrophe. We're also able to reflect what's going on so that people can see themselves. And I don't mean that in a representation way, right, but in a truly seeing our blind spots and seeing each other across the distance that is our differences. I'm also thinking a lot about Toni Morrison's concept of rememory, right? The recall of things that disappear but remain. And so when I hear Bedour talk about like, these are not happenings that are individual, right? That there is a pattern. I'm thinking about this recall of things that disappear but remain, but disappearing in our cultural memory. And this is why a lot of my work is cultural memory work. How do we remember things collectively as well as individually? How can I stage encounters on stage to help us remember? And remember, right? I'm thinking about community. And so when I hear Bedour ask, like, when we move, what's going to move against us? I am thinking about a maroon paradigm. Again, I am thinking about what it means to be in an inhospitable wilderness, right? And how to navigate that. And I see Black people as having traveling shoes, us being a migratory people. I see that as a maroon paradigm. And I'm exploring what that looks like in staging encounters in my work.
This is a
Jump
go
in.
ahead, please jump in.
Really quick, just to add to what you were saying, because, that excerpt that I mentioned of the traveling shoes is from Black Metamorphosis. And in it, right, she says that it's because that was the paradigm which defined life for Africans on the continent, which is why, right, that became the condition. That was the thing that they were able to carry over uninterrupted during the Middle Passage, was the propensity to domesticate change or to keep the traveling shoes nearby. Other things were metamorphosed, right, as she calls them, but that tendency was actually carried over. And that oftentimes, right, it's a violent process. This, process of domesticating change is not like pretty, right? But what's interesting is that when you look at when catastrophe changes from a dramaturgical definition to the one that is associated with calamity and disasters, it's actually not until 1748 that you actually get a definition in the Oxford Dictionary of catastrophe, meaning one or a series of events. And if you look at what happened between 1700 to the 1750s was, right, the rise of Protestantism, right, both in Europe, but especially in its export to the Americas. And what's interesting even more, right, is that Malthus, his father, was best friends with David Hume, right? And David Hume being a prominent, not only figure in the kind of empirical Enlightenment tradition, but a prominent believer in Protestantism being, right, the pragmatic antidote to the superstitions of Catholicism, right? And so much of the Protestantism that he believed in and that his Malthus daddy believed in and that Malthus then believed in, right, was this idea, right, that disastrous things or calamitous things were correctives, right, to whatever was incorrect on the surface of the earth. And even more, right, is once you get to the Americas, right, you have the kind of the fanning of Protestant fervor, because these were displaced Protestants, so that you tend to hold on to things more tightly than those people do where they were, right? And so what's interesting is that you don't get an understanding of catastrophe in the way that we understand it now, right? Until and this is why it's so important to know that, like, we didn't replace theology with science, as Winter tells us, that we simply began to theologize science, and that so much of what catastrophe is a theological hangover for conceptions of apocalypse, right? But it's veiled under this kind of rationalized, secularized idea, right? When you get to the Americas is when you really get an understanding and a definition, dictionary-wise, of catastrophe as when bad things happen. Right. And what's interesting is that in the dramaturgical sense, there's two definitions of catastrophe, right? Which is the overturning of what happened or an intensification of what happened in the prior act. Right. When you take what happened in the prior act and you turn it into a melodrama, and that's what catastrophe is, right? It took what was there, right, in Europe, and it intensified it in scope. And so then, right, you get more and more definitions, the more and more visual culture comes into play. So before there were theme parks, you could tour disaster zones in the United States in like the late 1780s. So anyway, a little etymological genealogy there from when we go from the dramaturgical to the scientific, which is still dramatic, but.
This is so fantastic, y'all. And thank you for jumping in. You know, I had saw that you tweeted about, you know, almost the amusement park history of disasters. And so I was hoping you would sort of like share a little bit more about that. So I'm feeling really, really special right now. I'm also like in my selfish bag. So I'm hoping, because we started a few minutes late, our panelists don't mind hanging on for a couple of extra minutes after, because I know I should switch to audience questions, but I got more questions. So I'm going to ask one more. Then I promise I'm going to hand it over to the audience and we'll close each other or this session out. We kind of been tap dancing like around this. And I think this becomes critically important for me because, you know, we are sort of living in this wake of post-humanism, in this wake of like the Anthropocene, you know, in this wake of people just like really romanticizing the collapsing of the planet, you know, the post-apocalyptic sort of universe or world. And I'm just sort of wondering, where does world making, you know, we can add in fugitivity and marronage sort of come into you all sort of like use of catastrophe? I think this time we'll start with Erika.
I mean, world building is what I do as a writer, right? Screenwriter, playwright. And so I am thinking a lot about, I'm going to share this, right? So I've always loved that Toni K. Bambara regards poets as community health workers and said that poets in her own cultural traditions have been regarded as priests and therapists and healers, and right, and that's from the 1982 interview she has with Kay Bonetti. And so in the same vein, later we get Robin D.G. Kelley saying poets, they speak truth, they are seers, clairvoyants, visionaries, and that when movements have been unable to clear the clouds, it has been the poets, no matter the medium, who have succeeded in imagining the color of the sky and rendering the kinds of dreams and future social movements that we're capable of producing, right? Arguing that the most radical art is not protest art, but work that takes us to another place, envisions a different way of seeing and perhaps a different way of feeling, right? Freedom dreams. And so I bring Bambara and Kelley into the frame of my response because I think that is world building, and that is the job of movement workers. And for movement workers to look at artists and look to artists, right? Toni K. Bambara wrote The Salt Eaters for movement workers and for artists and for spiritual healers, so that those camps would all come together. Something that we haven't exactly mastered quite yet, but I'm thinking about what it means to not just propose solutions to the problems of our time and our particular sociopolitical landscapes and immediate environments, but what it looks like to propose an entirely different world, right? And so that then, at least theatrically, begs us to do away with the constructs of how we do theater in the Western sense, right? It actually asks us to return to more Eastern sensibilities and ways of making art. And so I flooded a stage at the Public Theater in my latest work, Shadowland, which was the first installment of a 10-part Katrina cycle. And I got a lot of pushback initially around like, well, the magic of the water. There's rain, there's a flooded stage, all of these things. And this is not something that we do in the Western theater. We imagine water as light because it's expensive, because it's heavy. And that was exactly why I wanted to use it. For me, I'm thinking about the importance of actually including the elements. So I just returned from a really bomb convening of land stewards, water keepers, and artists. And in that convening, we were really dealing with what it means to literally build a new world and artistically build a new world, like within our works. And so for me, I'm thinking about putting catastrophe on stage, not as uh, Black trauma porn, but to really show the underbelly of catastrophe. So a lot of my work is about relationships between people. Again, catastrophe being related to relationships, right? And it's really about the interiority of Black women's lives and relationships and how catastrophe brings to surface other issues that are relational. And I'm really interested in that in regards to Black people and Black women and femmes particularly, right? What kind of ancestral wounds show up during catastrophe that we think is completely like, divorced from whatever is happening. For instance, colored water. There was someone who actually was hoping I was going to talk about colored water, and so here it is. Oh, that was you. Okay. So, right, colored water. We have 3 generations of Black women, girls, and femmes living in this house in 2016 in the height of the Flint water crisis. And the water crisis is the backdrop. It's the socio-political backdrop of the work. It's not the focus. I consider all of my work a recovery project. So it's an experiment. This is what I think world building can be, and even using history within world building. It's an experiment in recovering horrific cultural memories and infusing them with spiritual and socio-political utility. So like, for instance, I situate Hieroglyph, a play that I have in the imaginative afterlife of the Girl X case, to underscore how shame invisibilizes Black women and girls to the point of erasing our names, even when we survive a terror like rape. And so in that play, my protagonist, Davis, revisions her sexual assault through painting. She contextualizes her woundedness and deviates from acceptable artistic expressions of Black girlhood by employing grotesque imagery. And so instead of uttering an inarticulable shame, she sculpts it, right? And I think that is also the work of world building, and especially in more African and African American centered theater practices, where we understand that ain't no harm to moan, right? We understand that everything is not able to be articulated. And so in Colored Water, Marion, who is arguably the protagonist or antagonist, depending on where you land, she's a loyal General Motors employee, and she comes to the edge of her shame after realizing her complicity in the terror visited upon her family amid the Flint water crisis. And then Shadowland, my latest work, was examining Ruth's shame of contested desire, right? Selling her family business, and how the terror of Katrina and the subsequent flood belatedly redirects her wanting. And that is, I think, something that catastrophe and even staging catastrophe does. It can redirect our wanting. So whereas, pre-COVID, we were so tired and wanted a break and like on the grind, and then COVID, and everybody wants to be, about nature and getting plants, right? Redirecting our wanting. Okay, not Bedour, but like largely, right? There's a redirecting of what is important, right? And I'm thinking a lot about that. And so for me, in each of these apocalyptic worlds or catastrophic worlds, it's not the terror of the event themselves that is the greatest horror. It's the living in the shame of surviving or not. as well as being undone by shame and being active participants in the undoing of others. And so I'm thinking about catastrophe and our role in it in undoing others as well as ourselves, and what comes with the afterlife of terror, which I say is shame, what that looks like on stage and in real life.
Yes, I love this. So my lovely lab members are pushing me to stay on time, which I love. So I'm going to end my question there. Thank you for bringing up colored water. And we're going to ask, I think, like 2 or 3 questions from the audience, and then we'll close it out. So I'm going to pass it off to Anais. But Bedour or JT, if you have responses, go ahead and drop it in the chat for us. That will work.
Thank you for this amazing talk. It has been very illuminating. I have been reflecting so much. All of your comments have been marvelous. So thank you very much for being here and giving us your knowledge and all of your very fulfilling, and I'm just amazed. So thank you so much. So our first question is, let me read it for you. It says, do panelists think about naming tropical cyclones as a kind of ideological containment, externalizing or deflecting mostly human-caused harms to a revised anthropomorphized nature in the mid-1900s, a purposely decolonizing moment, a way to mask oppressive colonial power as a global north found new ways to deploy itself.
Do people want time to reflect on that? Or does someone want to jump in?
The people would like a repeat of the question or it typed in the chat.
Okay, it's kind of long, so I will type it in the chat and I will read it again. It says, do panelists think about naming tropical cyclones as a kind of ideological containment, externalizing or deflecting mostly human-caused harms to a revived, anthropomorphized nature in the mid-1900s as a purposefully decolonizing moment?
I think this goes along with what my co-panelists have been talking about as the kind of enclosures that happen through the catastrophic as ways of knowing and being. It forecloses other like points of possibility for thinking through relationality. I think that could be applied, to something like a storm, in the ways that a kind of naming of it creates this kind of anthropomorphic version of it that like does a sleight of hand at the same time, in the sense that it also, by giving a storm a name and therefore a certain type of agency, at least rhetorically, it facilitates the erasure or the hiddenness of like what actually drives the energy in the atmosphere up and up and up to create those kinds of storms. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question correctly, but I do think we have, from what I take as the kind of wider point, we do have to reevaluate how we understand and relate to all kinds of things, including stuff like storms, outside of this very Western understanding that, again, will facilitate a certain kind of name familiarity only to obscure the kinds of relations that are embedded beneath the eye of a storm.
Yeah, I think also like naming storms, like in the moment that you, like a name, like a concept or what have you, is an enclosure, right? And in the moment that you name something, presumably you own it, or you have a relation of domination over it, or you determine what is or isn't the outcome of this thing. I mean, it's like that famous scene in Robinson Crusoe, and he lands on the island after the shipwreck, and the first thing he does is, I name you Friday, and he owns Friday from that point, right? The native that he encounters on the island. And so I think it's a conceit, and it's a way of Western episteme trying to tell itself a lie, which is that if I can name something, I can own it and I can predict it and I can determine what will happen and what won't happen. And it is part of a conceit that Western epicene tells itself to say that it has control over certain things. Seems to me that that's also part of the lie, right, that is used to conceal the violence of the catastrophic as well. So yeah.
Thank you. And one more question would be, the various comments by the panelists make me think about insurance. I was wondering if the panelists could say something about that aspect of the political economy of catastrophe and its financial geographies.
Well, I have a section about this in my chapter on cruel mathematics. And well, essentially I talk about how it's not just the language of kind of prediction or accounting that's bound up in the catastrophic, but it's a whole computational vernacular and vocabulary that all works together to bind people under this condition of the cruel mathematic. And one of those things is prediction and speculation, and subsequently insurance. And we know that so many insurance companies built themselves on insuring slaves as cargo, right? And that being the rise of so much of what we understand to be the insurance industry, is that insurance was always meant to preserve goods. It was never meant to preserve lives. Like, that was not why insurance was invented. The idea was that you're responsible for preserving your own life. This is what liberalism says. We preserve property and you preserve your own life. That's on you, not on us. Well, unless you consent, right, to being ruled absolutely by me, then I can maybe protect your life, right? Social contract is what Hobbes might call it, that type of relation. But outside of that kind of a relation, more kind of the Rousseau, Locke, kind of more benevolent absolutist relation, is that we protect property and you protect your own life, right? And so insurance was never meant to preserve life. Well, what's happening now is that the theologizing of property, right, means that we allow for a slippage, right, in the way we discuss property to slip into the way we talk about, for example, human life, right? So when people see people destroying property, they call it violence. And you're like, well, there's no such thing as violence against property. Like, property doesn't have feelings. It's not life, right? But, right, we see the way that what is elevated to the status that human life should be elevated is actually, property, and insurance is fundamental to that. And like, life insurance is an extension of the insurance of other goods. It's not like the initial or even the most prominent form of insurance. And now what you have happening is all of these multimillionaires in Miami are finding it difficult to insure their fancy condos, right? Now suddenly, right, climate is a problem because they have to pay so much money to insure their condos, right? And their cars and their waterfront properties, right? But still is not getting at the real price, as Césaire might call it. They throw facts and statistics at my head, as he calls it. But I am talking about entire possibilities wiped out. We're not talking about the same thing, right? But also, you can never insure what actually needs to be insured, which is us here together, living on the planet, right? And that also ties into the idea of world making, because I was thinking about this when you were talking, Erika, because, I do believe that the world is what we make of it. But sometimes when we remake the world, we remake it in a way that's terrible, right? The presence and the existence of world making is no guarantee that the world will be a good thing, right? And the presence of intimacy and relation does not mean that intimacy and that relation is a good thing. Like Glissant, even in his expression of relation, in his novel, The Fourth Century, he talks about how in the hold of the ship, yes, some people tried to look out for each other, but some people tried to kill each other, right? So is the world that we make going to be one worth fighting for, even when we finish making it, right? And so, the world didn't have insurance, but when colonial modernity broke the world open and then remade it, it gave us insurance and bullshit, right? And the Anthropocene. And so, sorry, that was a long way of saying that the idea of insurance is obviously a holdover from the slave trade, and there's no way to concede to insurance without conceding, right, to the authority of that same paradigm.
Absolutely. I think you're making me think about M. Tracy Phillips' Zong, right? And for those who are not familiar, that excellent, challenging, poetic book is recalling the Gregson versus Gilbert case and the massacre of drowning about 130 enslaved Africans because of an insurance matter, essentially. I'm also thinking about privatization of water as we are experiencing a lot of water-related climate catastrophe. And not just the privatization of water on Earth. I'm thinking about, Nestle and Flint. But I'm also thinking about lunar colonization because I foresee, right, if they are finding water on the moon, that they will find a way to try to privatize that. And so when I think about the financial geographies of catastrophe, of course, I'm thinking about how insurance isn't designed to protect people unless people are property. But I'm also thinking about the privatization of natural resources that we actually need to live. So that's something that I'm thinking about.
I would say just very quickly that I think insurance, riffing off of both of my co-panelists, of course, it has a genealogy that tracks closely with slavery, but I think particularly with the kind of late 20th century neoliberal financialization of the economy, we're right to like point to what insurance tells us about anticipated deaths and anticipated futures, and what it and also the kind of foreclosures that happen when something isn't insured, or all these kinds of things that that are being mapped out and that are naturalized through a kind of capital of anticipation that's tied to calamity, loss, death, and the disastrous, and that becomes therefore profitable in those modes, and the ways that insurance is being mobilized as part of a larger portfolio that includes most of the insurance companies are now multinational, and they are purchasing large swaths of rural land that they're enclosing, often in places like Virginia, on top of the kind of older schemes that they used to, that used to govern the land, like the plantation or the plantation forest or whatever, is now being bought up by another rung of capital at the global scale, primarily through insurance companies who have a lot of investable money, because we all pay into this kind of logic of anticipated falling apart, or failure, or death, and to your to the other points that have been made about it being tied to objects, and particularly to slavery. And I think there's a negative. I mean, Black folks have never been insurable as property and capital, and then we know in all the ways uninsurable in our contemporary, whether that's through health insurance, life insurance, insurance for your house. None of that is insurable in relation to gender, racial, capitalist violence, and the demarcations of what is a financial future and what's a financial drain. And so I think those are being insurance is an important place to really think through the ways that horizons are being created about who is going to live and inhabit a future, what that looks like, and who is not anticipated to even be available in physical form for a future. So thank you for that question.
And what it does additionally, right, is that insurance, the Anthropocene, capitalism, they all share something in common, which is what Catherine McKittrin calls as the anticipatory language, right? And this overdetermination of the anticipatory, because in doing that, right, your eye is constantly on anticipating what is next, right? And you don't have the sightline necessary to look around you, right? And actually consider, right, on your own terms, what is happening around you. And not only that, right, it is anticipation, and the presence of the future is always present as a threat, right? The future is not present as anything other than a threat when it comes to insurance, when it comes to Anthropocene, and when it comes to capitalism. Capitalism tells you, well, you might not be able to retire, you better save in case something bad happens. Insurance, like you get this insurance because something bad's going to happen. Anthropocene is like, well, I don't know, like travel the world now because everything's going to be flooded in 10 years, right? Like the future is only a threat, right? But it also, we are locked in, right? Our sightline is completely locked into the anticipatory. And not only the anticipatory, but the idea of inevitability is baked into all of these things. And it's inevitable, Like everything is, the world is what we make of it, especially the bad stuff is what we made of it. And then you want to tell me that everything is inevitable. And as Robinson tells us, the development of capitalism wasn't even inevitable. It grew in fits and starts, and because people intervened, right, in the growth of it as a process. And so all of these things are really violent and intimate bedfellows, right? This idea of assurance and anticipation and all that. Anyway, sorry.
I thank y'all. I thank y'all so much. For the people who are still rocking with us, who've been here since 5 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We thank you. What we're sharing with y'all today cannot fit into the confines of time as we know it. So I appreciate y'all for hanging on, hanging tight. Thank you so much to our panelists. Can we get in the chat right now and just absolutely go off and show each and every one of them some love? We're going to close ourselves out really quickly, but my sincerest thank you to Erika, Bedour, and JT. Y'all literally just like tore the roof down in the church tonight. Everybody dancing, jumping, and going. So I appreciate y'all. I appreciate y'all.
Thank you.
Show them some love now.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody, for being here and for sticking around for an extra 10 minutes. It was perfect. You know, we started 10 minutes late and then here we go. Perfect, beautiful. So I just want to kind of close this out with just keeping an eye out for the After the Storm website that will be coming out in the fall of 2023. We're finally debuting our digital archive that we've been working on. So keep an eye out for that, and that will be kind of posted in our social medias and all of this. There are also other events that are coming up in the DSL. We're going to drop the link in the chat so you can kind of keep an eye out for other events that you'd like to participate in. And just thank you everybody so much. We're super appreciative.